Today we stay in beautiful Toronto, suburban Toronto, where we meet and greet one of its illustrious sons, Neil Gonsalves. He is a host of The Lens on RIVO TV, a TEDx speaker, and author of I Am Not Your Token, and has spent 25 years working in education, media, and leadership, and was recognized this year. That would be last year actually, with the 2025 Inclusive Leader Award. Welcome to this, our 226th episode of Open Up, a live podcast simulcasted on YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram, where we engage with knowledgeable and influential individuals on critical topics impacting men and boys and our society at large. My name is Dipchand Ramcharitar, Director of Outreach and Development at Voice of Men 360. We are based in London, Ontario, Canada, and essentially we advocate for and support men and boys, though we do reach out to other demographics as best we can. We are affiliated with International Men's Day, who operate internationally in a similar capacity. Before we get to our guest, Neil, here's our disclaimer, followed by a couple of important announcements. We would like to remind everyone that Voice of Men 360's mission is always delivered in good faith with the intent of peaceful harmony for all. The views and opinions shared by the participants are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of Voice of Men 360. Please know that our content is not a substitute for professional, medical, or therapeutic advice. If you are struggling with personal challenges, we strongly encourage you to reach out to a qualified expert. For questions or concerns about today's episode or any of our content, feel free to email us at info@voiceofmen360.org. And now for a couple of announcements. First off, the Canadian government has launched a nationwide campaign to improve the health of men and boys, and they want to hear directly from the public. That would mean you. This is a real opportunity to influence policies and programs that affect men, boys, and families across the country. Please take a few minutes to complete the questionnaire on the website that's now on your screen. Your input is critical. Without it, key perspectives will be missing from the conversation. So please keep in mind also, and this is critical, the deadline is June 1st. We're just less than 2 weeks away. So keep that in mind. Secondly, if you are a man involved in caregiving for an autistic child, adult, or family member, we want to hear from you. We're gathering input on the topics, challenges, and experiences you'd like to see covered in men's support and discussion groups. Your responses will directly shape future sessions and make sure they address what matters most to you. All responses are anonymous and confidential. Please take a few minutes to complete the survey. The deadline is June 30th, 2026. Your voice will help build the support that caregivers actually need. Sivam, do we have the link? Here's the link for the autism survey. Please, we ask that you go and get involved. We'd really appreciate that. Now on with the show, and a warm welcome to Neil Gonsalves, to Voice of Men 360's Open Up. Neil, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure having you. Go ahead, Neil.
Sorry, is my mic working?
No, it beginning muted, but go ahead. You're on.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's been a real pleasure. Every interaction I've had with Voice of Men 360 has been very positive and engaging, and I thought, why not engage in another dialogue? So happy to share, happy to take your questions today, and I hope this is an interesting conversation for your viewers.
I'm sure it will be. So why don't we start off with some background, including what, if anything, inspired you to the current path you're on?
I think the most honest answer I could give you is I arrived through my work primarily through observation. So, like everybody else, I was very much part of the grind, right? You go to work every day, you figure out how to keep the lights on. And over 20 years as an educator, I started to notice shifts in communication styles, tone, the manner in which we were sharing with each other across spaces. And it started to concern me. But more importantly, I didn't want that concern to turn into some negative frustration over things. I wanted to proactively contribute. And I spend a lot of time with young men and women too in the post secondary environment. I'm a father, and I have a close circle of friends that are deeply meaningful to me. And so this is my attempt at trying to give back to the community that has been so kind to me over my 32 years in Canada.
Excellent. So you didn't necessarily have a serendipitous moment. This is something that sort of transpired over time.
Absolutely. I think, I often, if this was a movie, there would be a dramatic moment, but I don't have a dramatic moment. I had a slow unfolding, right? And it's when you want to be a part of the community. And for me, that was very important. Canada has given me a home for 32 years. And my goal was to give back a little bit. And so I asked, what can I do to try and give something back to this country that's given me so much? And the answer I came up with was, what positive messaging could I put forward? What ideas could I share that can help us communicate across difference more fluently, but also more proactively, right? And that's really where this all starts. And then I think becoming a father really sharpened it all for me. And that's sort of what that's what really drove me. It was, what kind of future am I leaving for my son? What kind of example am I setting for him? And I wanted to be intentional and deliberate about those things. So.
Yeah, the part about giving back to Canada, who has done so much for you. I feel the same way. I've always made a point of it. Obviously, there's no utopia anywhere, and there's no Shangri-La. There's always going to be problems wherever you go. But Canada has been up in the first 5 to 10 countries for living consistently for a number of years now, and I am happy to be a part of it. And when problems come along, you deal with it. But other than that, it's a blessing to be here.
Yeah, on
So
balance, I mean, and to your point, right? On balance, you find good and bad with everything, and it really
exactly
depends on what you focus in on. Uh,
right.
we we came to Canada. We looked for a second, a new opportunity, a new life, and I try to focus on that. You take the good with the bad because there is no perfect anywhere you go, right? I
True.
would say on balance, there's more good than bad, though. So.
By far, yeah, I'd go along with that. So yeah, it's good to be here. And moving on to another area, you're part of the Heterodox Academy Canada.
Mhm.
Men's group often get labeled as regressive just for existing. I don't know how much experience you have with that. How do we defend the need for male only spaces without apologizing for it?
Well, that's a fantastic question, and I think that these are some of the realities that we have encountered with Heterodox Academy as well. So, at its core, Heterodox Academy is about supporting viewpoint diversity in a pluralistic society. It's not about prioritizing certain views over others. It's literally about listening with more charity and speaking with more clarity. I don't see the contention there, personally, but it does exist. And so I would be, I'd be remiss to not recognize. Sometimes in our modern sort of communication environments, we look at things we don't agree with and then try to frame that in a way that we can, quickly dismiss it or reduce it. And I think that the conversation around men and boys sometimes falls into that category. But I think that there are differences, meaning there is some validity to some of the claims. What does that mean? If the conversation around men and boys veers into grievance politics, or it becomes anti-woman or anti-marginalized group, then we're not actually representing healthy males, and that's not really the focus of what we're talking about. So if you caricature male conversation as a grievance politics based approach, you will get pushback. My point, and it's the same goal that Heterodox Academy focuses on. It's respectful discourse. It's being able to disagree without losing our relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, we have to be practical in terms of what is necessary and to go about advocating for and trying to stand up for men where it's justifiable in doing so. You don't attack other groups. You
Right.
know, you focus on what needs to be done as far as men and boys are concerned, and focus solely on that. And
Sure.
one of the things that I've come across in my time with the Voice of Men 360, and even before that, is that uh, people seem to have this tendency when you say that, you know, you're representing men and boys, you get a sort of automatic, a sort of a reflex pushback in that. So what about women and girls? You know, and
Right.
then you know, I see that out there, and I take it as something to address in terms of, well, this is why we're doing what we're doing,
Right.
and you know, like so that's something that sort of gotten used to,
For
and
me, sorry to interrupt you there, but for me, it's moving away from this either or thinking, right? And unfortunately, what's become increasingly common is this setting up polar binaries and then assuming
yes,
that nothing exists in the middle. A
right,
conversation, a healthy conversation about men and boys is not blaming women. It's not blaming other groups. It's looking at a set of problems and saying these exist amongst other issues, and we can only talk about one thing at a time and then combine those strategies over a long period of time. So, the focal point has to be overall, how do societies function better? What role do we all play? And I think the non contentious line is that men also have a role to play in society as collaborators in a shared future, not at the exclusion of women. We can't do society without half the population.
right.
But I think that line works both ways, right?
Yeah, you know, we have this sort of thing bandied about out there sometimes. You know, it's my way or the highway. We got to get beyond that and be more nuanced in our approach and more objective and practical. So these
Absolutely.
things certainly help to achieve the results that would be beneficial not only to men and boys but to society at large.
Absolutely. It's about teaching men not to resent or place blame outside. It's a little bit about taking accountability for our
Right.
participatory role in our
Yes.
situations sometimes. It's about becoming a little bit more emotionally open and available. And it's about challenging things from the past that don't work well for our development into the future, right? It's I prefer that sort of positive framing.
So do I. Now, you've spent over 20 years as a college educator. Over that time, what have you observed about male students participating, especially in terms of their communication and performance in the classroom?
So, it's interesting. I think that you see gender-based differences. That's without a doubt. I want to make the point, firstly, that some of these issues do impact all students because the big factors influencing our communication styles, like technology, social media, those sort of things, they have a universal impact. There are some things that impact some genders more than others. It also is dependent on, I want to make sure I'm saying this right. It's not absolute. It's not
Right.
everybody, right? So, having prefaced what I'm about to say, it's not everybody. It's not an absolute answer. Some of the things I've noticed is the manner in which we communicate. So, I'll start with this. Social media has a tendency to reward and promote the salacious, the thing that builds outrage, because anger and outrage and salaciousness moves faster than reason and calmness and judicious thinking. So what they are exposed to influences their sense of reality, right? I think that's an important point. The second, which I would tie to media on a larger level, is the mere amount of misinformation. Misinformation is particularly problematic because today misinformation is transmitted in a very, very convincing way. So if you get the right influencer with the right technology, they put up some compelling narratives, and those will have a major influence on a society that does not read as much. And we don't. We readership, if in general, newspapers, books, they're all on the decline. I think I saw a very alarming stat that said nonfiction books, only about 3% of them get read cover to cover, which is a
Wow.
scary, scary number to me, right?
Yeah.
So if you're reading less and you're consuming bite-sized pieces of information that lack context, it's going to influence your communication. That's one. The second thing is, if you are in an environment where failure is not always an option. So we've removed this, and I always say this, we have somehow forgotten how to fail forward, make mistakes, learn from it, and then move in a productive direction. Now combine those two things: bad information at the source, and then a failure or a fear of failure will have a lasting impact on what you're willing to say. So you tend to
Right.
default to what is most viral, not what is most thoughtful.
Right. And over the time that you've been an educator, what has changed and what concerns you the most?
Well, I think most recently AI. AI is AI has existed in some form or another for a very long time. I think what's different, and we get lost in the nuance, AI exists in our cars. We are perfectly happy with that. It exists on our apps. Generative AI has changed the landscape of education. And generative AI is not a negative. I'm not a naysayer or a Luddite that says we should just get rid of it. But I think it is a very, very powerful piece of technology that has to be integrated responsibly. And this is somewhere where the gaps exist. What it's meant to do is replicate easily repeatable tasks. What it's not meant to replace is deep learning. And so, what I'm noticing in the classrooms is that we're utilizing it for deep learning, but then we're not actually doing the learning. We're taking AI's deep learning and we're presenting it. And that's a critical problem, I think. Now, I'll tie your last two questions together. One of the challenges I'm seeing in the college is that interpretation is arriving long before engagement, which means we're taking somebody else's interpretation and we're not really engaging with tough conversations, new information, things that challenge our existing beliefs. And that will have a lasting impact.
Yeah, and different AI platforms might have a different versions of the same subject, and that could be in itself a serious issue to contend with because, I guess how it's programmed so it would react.
Right.
And so that's another concern that people should have about it. Now, like everything else, when it comes to technology, there is a good and bad side to it. So we try to maximize the good
Right.
and try and stay away from that which would sort of put a burden on not only ourselves, on society as well.
But those things require we have to be critically open to see the value and the risks. And
Right.
we need to be honest about both ends of that. Now, if you look at all of these technologies coming together, in an environment where a misstep, a wrong word, a phrase that's clumsy, right? If I said something tonight that was a little clumsy and I was quoted out of context, am I willing to clarify and position it? Or am I so socially cautious that I'm afraid to say anything? I think with a lot of young men, what I'm seeing is a lot of social caution. They don't want to say the wrong thing. They don't
Yeah.
want to appear in the wrong space. And so sometimes what ends up happening is they disengage, because disengaging feels safer than engaging and making a mistake, right?
Yeah, because I guess one of the things that happened, I'm not sure if it's a sort of taken a back seat now, but one of the things that came up a while ago was this thing called cancel culture. And if you say something 20 years ago, or 10 years ago,
Right.
that at the time may have been the norm.
Right.
I'm not condoning one way or the other. I'm just stating something descriptively.
Yep.
And, the people are afraid still of, saying the wrong thing, treading on the wrong toes. And so they prefer, as you say, to take a back seat, stay away, as opposed to tackling an issue that should they have the ability to do so, but they would rather stay away from it because of the repercussions that might follow.
Yeah, and I don't think that it's necessarily all bad. Some of it, I think maybe intent has gotten lost in the conversation somewhere. But I really do come back to this. If we listen more charitably to the things people are saying, if we don't turn them into caricatures of what, of the worst versions of what we think they are, and then we speak with clarity and are willing to repeat, to clarify where required. And I think if you do it that way, as opposed to setting up everything as an either or grievance, then I
Yeah.
think you're less likely to find yourself in that kind of friction.
Yeah, that's a good point. And excuse me. Now you've been a first generation immigrant, and you've spoken about raising a son while navigating culture. Now this is a sort of a tricky area. You while navigating cultural differences. What's the tension you felt most between the culture you came from and the Canada your son was growing up in?
So I've always, I wish I could tell you I don't have the perfect answer. I have where I'm at today. The
Yeah,
tension was never simply old culture versus new culture. It was more about deciding which parts of my culture, my upbringing, is important to preserve, and which parts of my son's experiences are important to integrate, and then finding the way to let those two evolve in a somewhat natural way, right? That's the challenge. That's the tension. Because I don't believe that we need to dismantle or kind of walk away from our culture completely or
right.
completely refute it. I think we have to be critical about what worked well, what didn't work well, what could work better. And so, I'll share this. I am culturally or ethnically, I'm East Indian. That's, I grew up, I was born in Bombay, but I grew up in Dubai. So I grew up in Dubai in the United Arab Emirates. And like I mentioned, 32 years ago, I came to Canada. Those are three very different countries, right? The United Arab Emirates, India, and Canada. And
Right.
along the way, I've picked up things that were locally appropriate, that were socially, engaging or appropriate for the time, because that time evolved, society evolved. And then I have a son who's born in Canada in, the 21st century, and he reminds me of that all the fact that I was born in the previous century. But it's about finding what works, and I think that there were some things that were really positive. I have a deep sense of community, a strong sense of patriotism and gratitude. I also have things that maybe today, in not properly handled, could be seen as a negative. I come from a time and a culture where stoicism was, a virtue beyond reproach, and emotional suppression was almost expected in men. We were supposed to, be strong and resilient, and that leaves some things off the table. And I don't necessarily want my son to adopt all of those attitudes and thinkings. I don't need him. I try not to say things that I heard. I try not to say man up. Don't cry. These are some of the things that were normal, uh, but those things are not helpful. So where's the value in community, in family, in network? Those things are important. I'll never shut them. And then balancing that with, is it's also okay to express yourself, man, and that doesn't make you weak. And maybe that was some old school messaging that is due for an update.
Yeah, well, that was my. I was going to follow up and ask you about balance, the balance or not, because we all, when we come from a different country, there are certain things you will go to your grave with. They're that important to you,
Right.
and of course, you want to assimilate. You have to respect and appreciate the new culture that you come into. Okay, so and that's where the balancing act comes in. What do you keep? What do you let go? What do you inherit from your new culture? What do you take in? And things like that. And Canada, with my experience, gives you a fair degree of latitude in
Right.
terms of what you can what you can do here.
Right.
And we should be thankful for that. And obviously, there are some things. I come from Trinidad and the Caribbean, and there are some things that we do there that like for example, carnival days, you can be on
Right.
the street and traffic has to wait on you as
Right.
a while you gyrate in the middle of the street. Now, obviously, you can't do that here, and I can't hold that against Canadians. I mean,
Right.
that would be very
They,
narcissistic of me.
they might if they sold doubles on the side of the street, though.
They just might. But
The,
I look at what I have been able to bring here, and I'm happy about that. And Yeah, lots of things about Canadian society that I appreciate, and
Right.
so it's a blend of the two for me. And
So I'll say this, the word assimilation over the 32 years I've been here, I've heard it described in a negative way. And I prefer the word adaptation. I don't have a problem with the word assimilation, but I
right,
like the word adaptation better because I have adapted every time I've moved to my new environment, right? And my new
right,
environment has asked some things of me, but it's also given me some things. And those things I don't take for granted. So for one, right out the gate, this beautiful ability I have to speak and share my ideas, to write. I write on a regular basis. To write and be challenging on in terms of being critical about what I'm observing. That's something we take for granted here, but it's
yeah,
not something I always had. I couldn't speak as freely in places I've lived before. I definitely couldn't criticize, government policy openly in writing and so on. And so, to me, the ability to engage critically, whether you agree or disagree, is a beautiful benefit of a free society. And I'm the recipient of that, right? So I get some things, and so then I have to return that back. And one of the ways I return that back, and this is something that's changed for me. I think if you met me 15 years ago, I would have referred to myself almost like a hyphenated Canadian, an Indian Canadian. I
right.
don't use the hyphen anymore. I'm a Canadian. I pay my taxes here. I contribute here. I vote here. I've dropped the hyphen. It doesn't mean I don't appreciate the parts of Indian culture that are valuable to me,
Yeah,
that have shaped my personality and my ways. But I'm Canadian, and I try to start there. So when I talk to my son, it's not about getting him to choose between an old culture and a new culture. It's showing him how we adapt. And, maybe one day he'll move somewhere. I don't know, right? Adaptation is important. The give and take is important.
yes, and that's a sort of a model way we should approach. When we have children as first generation immigrants, how we can get that message across to them without taking away from the past or the future,
Right,
or where we are currently rather.
right.
That's certainly a way to go. Now, let's discuss a bit about a broken soul. You've explored men's mental health and you've talked about your view of male friendships, how it has changed with age.
Mhm.
What did you believe about friendship that has changed over time?
So I co-authored that book with my dear friend Brian Sankersing, and he's from Trinidad and Tobago, and he's a prolific writer. He's a beautiful soul. We got together and we wrote this story. It's a fiction. It's a piece of fiction, and it's trying to capture in a dramatic way what's going on inside the mind of this man that refuses to talk to anybody. And of course,
Right,
by the time he realizes that this is a problem, if at all, he's already deep in crisis, right? And he's sort of devolving into the state of manic, and into a manic state. The purpose of the book was not to obviously glorify that crisis stage. It was to highlight that sometimes men feel a little lonely and they don't often share that and communicate that until too late, right? So it was a dramatic way of making a point. But I think this is really at the core what Brian and I were trying to do with this book was we were trying to say, look, a lot of male friendships seem to follow a pattern. We talk about very little, right? We'll sit and watch a game and we'll joke around, and we use humor and irony, and we avoid anything that's deep, and that's not necessarily a positive frame, right? Men, like every other group, have the capacity and the affinity to understand what other men are going through in a unique way, right? In that they've experienced it. It's a space in which you can get people to understand where you're coming from. Maybe they've been through what you've been through,
right.
and what the goal was to show, communicate deeply and meaningfully, and you don't have to do that with a lot of people. Have a few good friends, and
Right.
a few good friendships that kind of defy this whole idea that we just have to watch a ball game or a cricket game or a football game,
Yeah.
and avoid anything that's difficult. We're trying to say that's not healthy, and maybe we need to start talking before the crisis. So therapy is good if you need it.
Yeah.
And maybe it's good to form a baseline and do that on a regular basis. What we're trying to suggest is that maybe don't wait until there's a crisis to look out for help. Build some protective factors, have a good support structure around you, and lean in and reciprocate that kindness to the men in your life, right?
Absolutely. And, it's quote unquote notorious of men to be reluctant when it comes to opening up about anything that they might be vulnerable with. So it's certainly something that needs to be addressed, and there is a certain degree of I guess apprehension when dealing with that, because sometimes when you do open up, you get told to man up, or you're what's wrong with you, step up and do things. So
You
when it
know,
comes,
too many of our friendships, too many
yeah,
of our friendships are activity based, without that willingness to be open. And so as I got older, what I realized was that to a certain extent, and I don't mean to be dramatic when I say this, I think men are sometimes socially highly functional and emotionally starving, right? They have the capacity to get up in the morning and go to work and do all of those things. And what I'm saying is some balance is probably important and necessary. Right?
yeah. So when it comes to positive things about male friendship, what does role does that play in keeping men's mental health intact?
Well, I think for one, it builds community and support, right? So, what we're trying to get at is in an environment without protective factors that are supportive, without community that's supportive, sometimes some experiences can be very isolating. And if you are feeling isolated and then you add to that the feeling that you can't talk to other people, well, then that has a knock-on effect that sort of accumulates, right? I'm saying men tend to communicate sideways, meaning, generally we're looking at the TV screen and kind of making passing comments to the side. I'm saying we need to engage more. We need to
Yeah,
engage more because once you realize that we have more in common with people than we have that differentiates us, you start to realize that maybe someone has been through that experience. Maybe they can lend some insight. Or maybe it's just the year you need to listen because you're feeling like a lot of stuff is pent up and you've got no way or no space to talk about it. So this gives you a safe space, if you will. And I'm not a big fan of that term, but the intent is correct. You know, it gives us a place where we can reliably and predictably have some security to know that we're being understood, to know that the challenge doesn't in any way make us less socially functional or viable, providers if you see yourself in that role.
mm,
It's asking us to move beyond the simplistic labels that we assign ourselves
right.
and move into something that is, more real, more based on the challenges. Health, as we age, our health changes. We're not as strong as we once were.
Yeah,
We're not as fast as we once were. And that sense of mortality starts to kick in as you approach the back nine of life, right? And I'm
yeah,
saying you don't have to do it alone. Like, I'm not a psychotherapist, I'm not a social worker, but as a writer, as a communicator, as a father, as a friend, I think that we all have a role in building healthy communities, right?
yeah, for sure. And you've been in the limelight on TV, TEDx, and whatnot. In terms of your experience at CBC, Metroland, TEDx, and RIVO, where do you see the biggest foundational cracks for men in Canada right now?
I think that for me, all of those experiences have sort of led me down to a certain conclusion, if you will. And that is too often when we are afraid of disagreement, and so we isolate, too often we don't communicate because of fear. And what that does is it prevents us from realizing we can disagree or we can live in a state that is not always pleasant. It can be temporarily uncomfortable without rupture, without losing the relationships that value, right? That we value. So a lot of the things I write about, a lot of the things I talk to guests about on my show, it's about challenging the prevailing narrative. It's being willing to have a discussion and ask critical questions without fear of losing relationship. And I think that is a feature of modern day society that is actually regrettable, which is too often people are afraid that if they speak their mind, they'll lose their relationships. And I'm saying we can disagree and we can agree and we can communicate. And it doesn't mean the end of our relationships, right?
Yeah. So what do you think where do we start? What's one beam we can start repairing together?
Well, for one, I would say, let's stop caricaturing everybody we disagree with. So if, we're very, very quick to label people. So if I don't like what you're saying, if I label you and assign you some characteristics, then I don't have to actually engage in the conversation. And that's going to continue to polarize us. It's going to continue to move us into this us versus them sort of dichotomy that prevents us from seeing value in other people or sharing our perspective so they can see value in us, right? And I think both things are equally important. So I'd say, honestly, in a society today, if we can address the way we talk to each other, not about each other, but to each
To
other,
each other.
we see people, and this is how I frame it. You have to be fair in your representation of what somebody else is saying. B, they have to have moral standing, meaning you have to see them as a legitimate part of society. So you don't get to dismiss somebody because you don't like their views. They have something to contribute and they are a legitimate part of society. And then from there, you have to engage in goodwill. You have to be charitable, but you have to be clear as well. And I think that's key to changing the temperature on our dialogue, on our discourse, and on our interactions. And I think that will make a big difference, I believe.
Yeah, and that's a very good point. We need to start talking to each other. Something we don't do. We talk at each
At
other,
each other.
and we talk to not to listen but to answer. We to respond. That's always on our mind. What we need to say next.
Right.
So it's important to and critical to listen to people whenever they speak. Even though you may disagree with them, you
Right.
give them a hearing. It's vital that you do that.
But equally, I think that and I use some people don't like when I say it. When I say you have to listen charitably, what I really mean by that is we need to stop recognizing everybody's speech as perfect, right? So if it's less than perfect, it's a problem. And I always say this: sometimes perfection is the enemy of the good. If you think about it that way, we are looking at AI curated content that's perfect. We're looking at curated social media content that's perfect, and we think that everybody has to speak that way. But you know
Right.
what? I misspeak. I make mistakes.
Yeah.
Do I have the intellectual humility to correct myself? That's going to make a difference. But
Yeah.
if I say something wrong and then I just double down because I'm afraid of
Yeah.
admitting I'm wrong,
Yeah.
then that's a problem. So you have to accept that people in normal everyday speak will make mistakes. And you have to not interpret what you think they mean. Try asking them, tell me more. Tell me more about what you're saying. Maybe you just didn't understand where they were coming from. And I think that level of charity is really important for communication. I don't think we do it enough.
Yeah, that's for sure. And sadly, one of the poisonous elements that comes out of all of this is the fact that when people disagree with somebody else's opinion, what they do, they highlight all the bad stuff that the person, even out of context, if they have to, just to make a point against that person. And that's something we need to get past because it's not healthy for anybody concerned.
No, not at all.
Yeah. And this is a bit of a more of a fun part.
Okay.
Not that we haven't been having fun so far.
All
And
right.
so next 5 questions are one-word responses. I would
Okay.
like from you. Starting is with, what's one word men need to hear more of?
Needed, that they're needed.
Okay, that's good. And what's one word that men need to say more of?
Struggling. I'm struggling. I'm having a bad day. We need to say that more when we
Yeah,
are.
we really do. Token or truth, which costs you more?
Truth, always. Which doesn't mean we shouldn't tell it, but we should be. But truth definitely costs you more because it's always easier to stand against something than it is to stand for something, right?
Right. Speech or silence, which is riskier for men today?
Oh, I'm going to say silence is riskier because downstream impacts of silence just compound and it leads us down bad places. So silence definitely riskier.
Yeah, yeah, true. And finally, finish this. Moral courage is,
Consistency and integrity. So, moral courage is the capacity to genuinely listen to people and engage across difference. It's asking questions that are designed for us to learn what somebody means, not assume, and not definitely not to answer in advance. And it's about finding ways to agree and share space and place with people from across the spectrum where we may not always have the same views, but to do so with a level that sees them as legitimate parts of our society and therefore collaborators in a shared future. That to me is moral courage.
yeah, that's for sure. So I have one final area to cover with you, but before I do, I just want to forward some further information about our organization. Our phone number is 226-289-8784. Email address is info@voiceofmen360.org. Our website is www.voiceofmen360.org. We're pretty much on all major social media platforms, including Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok. Please join us through any of the above. We encourage your participation by becoming a member or through questions and suggestions. We welcome them all. So, Neil, I have one final area to, well, really is for you to offer whatever you think in terms of contact information for those out there who might be interested in learning more about you.
So one of the best ways to engage with me, quite honestly, is through LinkedIn or Substack. My Substack is where I write and I share ideas about things that are socially relevant. And there's a thriving community page there. You can comment on the post, you can share an idea, you can communicate with me through that way. And then of course I'm very active on LinkedIn as well. You can reach out to me there, and I share some of the things I'm doing personally and professionally on that space. So I think those are good ways to connect with me if you're trying to reach me.
Excellent. Well, it's been a pleasure having you, Neil. Neil Gonsalves, author, host, TEDx speaker, and a man willing to speak with unapologetic clarity. So we truly appreciate the time you've spent here, and hopefully the audience would have gathered information that's meaningful and helpful to them, across the board. You've written about broken souls and refusing to be tokens. Today, you gave us both the truth about the breaks and courage not to be reduced. So, again, Neil, thank you so much for being part of Open Up.
It has absolutely been my pleasure. I thank you for inviting me. I just hope every man out there, every person out there remembers that pain does not become weakness when spoken.
Right?
Sometimes when spoken, it's the first step towards reaching out to a community that's there to support you. So I hope
Words
people
of
speak.
wisdom. Words of wisdom. Appreciate it. A couple of reminders on things we've mentioned earlier. The Canadian government is gathering public input to improve the health of men and boys. Please take a few minutes to complete their questionnaire. Your input would help shape real change. There's the link on your screen right now. Please go there. You have until June the 1st to say your piece, and say your piece you should. So please go out there, go into the website and fill out that questionnaire. And secondly, if you're a man caregiving for an autistic family member, we're collecting your input to shape future men's support groups. The Google Docs information is on your screen right now. The survey is anonymous, remember that, confidential and open to all until open to men caregivers until June 30th, 2026. So for the men listening, moral courage isn't a TED talk as such. It's a decision. It's asking for help. It's telling the truth. It's building foundations when it will be easier to watch them crack. To everyone listening, bear witness to your own life and to the men around you. Thanks again, Neil, and thanks to all of you who were tuned in today. We truly appreciate your time and attention. This is Voice of Men 360 saying, be good to yourselves and others around you. We'll see you around next time. Cheers.